Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into one of the most dramatic, high-stakes, and truly pivotal chapters in modern history. We are going to explore the Quit India movement of 1942. And look, this isn't just your standard history lesson. It's a genuinely fascinating look at how a massive, global empire was shaken to its absolute core by sheer human willpower.
So, to kick things off, here is a crazy paradox for you to think about. How on earth does a movement, one that was completely stripped of its top leaders before it even fully got off the ground, manage to bring the mighty British Empire to its knees? It's an incredible story of grassroots power, so let's set the stage.
Okay, to really understand 1942, we kind of have to rewind a bit and see how the pressure had been building up for decades. This was actually the third major phase of the Gandhian era. Back in the 1920s, we had the non-cooperation movement. Then, the 1930s brought the civil disobedience movement. By this point, Indian citizens were actively voting in provincial elections, and political consciousness was just off the charts. The pressure cooker had been simmering for a long time, and it was leading right up to this third massive wave, the Quit India movement.
Section 1. The World War II Spark. You know, what's super interesting about this specific moment in time is the pure pragmatism of it all. In 1939, the Second World War breaks out. Indian leaders realized that this global crisis was actually a critical window of opportunity. So they made a very clear, logical offer to Britain. They basically said, look, we will support you in the war effort because defeating the global threat of fascism is absolutely necessary, but in exchange, you must grant us independence after the war. So how did Britain respond? Well, they sent the Cripps mission to negotiate, but ultimately they totally refused the core demand. The mission failed. The British basically said, yeah, let's just wait and see. But for the Indian leaders, waiting was no longer on the table. An immediate, decisive movement was the only option left.
Section 2. The Do or Die Ultimatum.
So it's 1942, and all that simmering tension we talked about finally just boils over into a definitive, nationwide call to action. Mahatma Gandhi realized it was time for a new, final push, and he delivered an absolute ultimatum to the masses. It's captured perfectly in 3 simple words: do or die. He made it crystal clear that they would either free India or they would die in the attempt. Now, he still maintained his strict principle of nonviolence for sure, but the message was fiercely resolute. There was no turning back, no more compromises. It was time for the British to pack up and quit India.
Now, you didn't think the British government was just going to sit back and watch this happen, right? No way. They anticipated the uprising entirely. Their strategy was to crush the movement before it could even take a single breath. So around 1942, they executed these massive preemptive arrests. We're talking rounding up the entire top tier of leadership, including Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru, and throwing them straight into jail. They figured, hey, if we cut off the head of the movement, the body's just going to die out.
Section 3. A leaderless rebellion.
But man, did they miscalculate. And it brings up a really fascinating point. How do you actually measure the success of a true leader? It's not just about what they achieve when they're standing right there in the room, directing traffic. A true leader's success is measured by what happens in their absolute absence. Because even with all the major leaders locked away behind bars, the vision had already been planted. The people knew exactly what they had to do. The momentum didn't stop, it actually multiplied. And honestly, this is incredibly relevant today. When you look at modern, decentralized grassroots movements all over the world, you see this exact same dynamic. A powerful, unified idea can sustain a movement entirely on its own, completely independent of a single charismatic figurehead.
Section 4. Attacking the Empire.
So without the top brass to guide them, who steps up? Ordinary people, especially the youth, who spontaneously took absolute charge of the rebellion. And the sheer scale of this grassroots uprising was staggering. You had students literally dropping out of their studies, deciding that fighting for freedom was way more important than sitting in a classroom. Factory workers went on massive strikes, and they didn't just protest quietly on the corner either. They directly targeted the symbols of state authority. They attacked police stations, dismantled communication lines, and forced newspaper printing presses to completely shut down. The public effectively paralyzed the British administration's ability to communicate and control the country.
The defiance actually reached such an incredible peak that in some regions, they entirely rejected British rule and started setting up their own independent parallel governments. Like in parts of Uttar Pradesh, they basically declared themselves free and set up local administrations that completely ignored the British crown. They essentially looked at the British and said, yeah, you no longer govern us, we govern ourselves.
Section 5. The brutal British crackdown.
Naturally, an empire does not surrender its crown jewel without a fight. The British realized they were rapidly losing control, and their response was utterly horrific. Just let this number sink in for a second. 90,000. The British adopted severe, desperate methods of repression. They started arresting people at such a rapid pace that the jails literally ran out of space. By the end of 1943, over 90,000 ordinary people had been thrown into overflowing prisons just for demanding their freedom.
But sadly, it gets much darker. The police weren't just arresting people anymore. They were opening fire on the public. Over 1,000 people were killed in these police firings. These were ordinary citizens, many of them totally unarmed, facing down the barrels of imperial guns.
And in what has to be the most shocking display of desperation and violence, the state resorted to some truly extreme measures. Orders were actually given to use airplanes to fly over protesting crowds and fire down upon them with machine guns. Just contrast that for a moment with the movement's core philosophy of nonviolence. The British state was unleashing absolute terror from the skies against civilians just to try and crush this rebellion.
Section 6. The beginning of the end.
But here's the thing. Despite all that terrifying violence, and despite the leaders undertaking severe hunger strikes while locked inside their jail cells, the British grip on India was slipping. And it was slipping fast. Think about it. Before World War II, Britain was an unchallenged global superpower. But by the late stages of the war, the situation had entirely flipped. Britain was utterly exhausted, financially, militarily, and morally. On top of all that, they were facing immense diplomatic pressure from their own allies. Democratic nations like the United States, who were backing Britain in the war, were pressuring them, basically asking, how can you fight for freedom in Europe while violently denying it to India? When you combine that relentless international pressure with the sheer, uncontainable force of the massive Indian uprising, the British were finally forced to their knees. They simply could no longer hold on.
This massive internal rebellion absolutely broke the empire's spirit. But as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a fascinating question to chew on. While millions of Indians were protesting and facing down machine guns from within the country, there was an entirely different strategy unfolding right outside India's borders. Who was out there, meticulously building an actual army, the Azad Hind Fauj, to fight the British from the outside? The story of Subhash Chandra Bose and the Indian National Army is just as gripping, and that is exactly what we will be exploring next time. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep that curiosity alive, and I'll catch you in the next one.